All right, without further ado then, I'm going to say Margie, welcome. For those of few people who may not know Margie yet, I can't imagine anyone not knowing Margie yet who's involved with plants. Margie was my very, very first contact with Maryland plants, with Tennessee plants. When I was living in Maryland and was building a house in Tennessee, I knew I wanted to do natives. And I went online and I looked for some information and I came up with this book about gardening with the native plants of Tennessee, The Spirit of Place by Margie Hunter. So I real quick sent her an email. There was an email attached where I found it. So I sent her an email and said, I really, really, really want your book because I'm moving to Tennessee and I'm gonna plant natives one way or another. I'm gonna find natives. And she wrote me a nice little note and I bought her book. And that was our first contact. And it's been good ever since. Margie has been involved with she was one of the earlier members of the Tennessee Naturalist Program and was secretary. You were an early one, weren't you?
I was co-founder.
What?
Co-founder.
You were one of the co-founders. Okay. You and Pandy and David.
Mm-hmm. And Cindy Smith Walters
and Cindy.
And then of course the folks at Alice Hill, Margaret Cameron and so forth.
Yeah. So she's been with the Naturalist Program since the very beginning and still is an active member with that, I'm sure. Nobody's going to let you get away from that program. She's been secretary of TNPS, but she ended up with a lot more on her plate, I think, at one point than she really bargained for. Margie has just been active with so many plant organizations in one fashion or another here in Tennessee. And she's a wealth of knowledge. She's a good person to have for a friend. And if you go up to the Nashville the Nashville Lawn and Garden weekend up in Nashville, Margie is there. She's managed to bring together 4 of us groups, 4 plant groups into one booth. So you really get pounded with any kind of information you want about Tennessee natives or invasives or anything about the natural part of Tennessee. So that's a good place if you really want to see Margie and sit down and talk with her. Come up to that. You probably find her wandering around somewhere. If she's not giving a talk, she might be in the booth.
Better yet, come volunteer.
This is true. Very, very true. She's also, in her downtime, she likes to hike the Appalachian Trail. Have you completed it yet?
Oh gosh, no. No. A long way to go.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, Margie Hunter talking about invasive plants here in Tennessee.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Karen. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate all of you that have come to hear this particular talk. There's not too much exciting about invasive species. And so, especially compared to the other wonderful topics that have been part of these seminars. So the fact that you'd want to spend your Tuesday evening talking about some of the worst plants ever, I hats off to you and thank you for being here. But it's important. There's a lot of good stuff to learn about this where you can make a difference. And so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to share my screen here and my desktop, share my desktop.
Oh,
Oh, yes. That's, well, unfortunately, little Tucky is no longer with us, but he was my little boy. And so anyhow, all righty. So this is the presentation here, and we're going to talk about invasives. I want to explain to you how they wind up becoming invasive in our area. And And then a few things that you can do about it, especially to be able perhaps to help us gather data on some of these so that maybe we can actually do something from a legal perspective about them. So without further ado, we're going to start off here looking at things from 250 million years ago, because that does have a strong impact on some of the plants that are invasive here in Tennessee. So the last time all the continents came together to form a supercontinent was about 250 million years ago. It was Pangea. And as it began splitting up, it split up where all of the continents that are in the northern hemisphere split from all the continents that are in the southern hemisphere. And that started around maybe 200 million years ago. So North America, Europe, and Asia are in the northern hemisphere. They were part of Laurasia, which was one of the sub-supercontinents, I guess, after Pangea broke up. So there's a lot of connection between those continents. And over that 200 million years, it moved around. They began kind of shifting apart. The climate changed, et cetera. And another very important thing that was going on during that 200 million years is the rise and then rapid diversification of the angiosperms, which are our flowering plants. And so that's going to have a very important impact on us in terms of these invasive species. Because the land masses were together often, there were land bridges connecting the three continents. There was a lot of movement and migration of these species back and forth, such that there's a pretty strong relationship between the flora and the fauna in Asia, in Europe, and in North America. A good example of that I like to share with folks is our state tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, the tulip poplar. There's only one other species of Liriodendron in the world, and that's Liriodendron chinensis, which is in China. And there are multiple examples of genera that we share: Magnolia, Trillium, Viburnum, the list goes on and on. And so that strong connection is an important factor in those kinds of species then that are most likely to be invasive for us. Another thing to understand before we get into the technicalities of invasive species is how ecosystems develop, how they evolve over time, how species evolve in conjunction with one another. So they develop with the landscape, the geology, the topography, they develop with the climate, and they develop with each other. And so they develop a way in which they can minimize competition, if at all possible, and kind of stabilize a functioning community. So there are checks and balances in play there, so that ideally no one organism is going to take control, right? Everything gets eaten and everything eats. So, it stays in balance. So systems that have evolved over many, many, many years wind up then having this special relationship and functionality associated with it. And that's important to remember. So it doesn't matter where a plant is native, it has gone through that process in its area with the other organisms in that area as well. So need to keep those two things in mind. So when species do move, and ranges are dynamic for species, and they will move and shift. But it's typically slow and incremental when nature is in charge. This allows for adaptation, both the species to the environment and the environment to the species. But we, on the other hand, do things a little bit differently. We go over to China and we see all these cool things over there, and it's like, we want. And so we've got to grab it, bring it over here, plop it down in our backyards. And so it's a rather precipitous plucking it out of its environment and sticking it into a foreign environment. So when you do that, there's the possibility of three potential outcomes. One, it could struggle and die because it's just not going to survive here. The other is that it could survive if you take care of it. And we have plants like that in our gardens that we have to work with to manage. But then there are species that feel right at home here. And so they can live independently. not only do they survive with our help, but they can actually do it without our help. They can begin to reproduce on their own. And so when a plant does that, we call that naturalization. So that plant has become naturalized in that environment. So one of the cool things, and that's just a little strip across the top, but I can still see it all right. So I'm hoping you can see it all. So there's the established and emerging threat species. So the TNPS, the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council, I'm a board member with them as well. They have two lists, basically, of species that they've identified as invasive in the state of Tennessee. So established and emerging threats are those species that can get into intact natural systems. So places that normally don't have much in the way of disturbance going on, but these species can still get into it and begin to invade and reproduce and cause problems. The other list is for those species that don't necessarily get into intact systems, but they can be problematic in disturbed areas. So we have these two lists, and I thought I would go through the list and look to see where the origin was for each one of these species. And as I did this, I discovered something actually pretty interesting. So it's no surprise that the overwhelming vast majority are Northern Hemisphere plants because, you know, there you go, Pangea and Laurasia. But what was surprising is that those species that are the most problematic in established and emerging list comprise like 2/3 of those are from Asia, and about 1/4 of those are from Europe and Eurasia. But you go to the disturbed list and those percentages flip-flop. The Asian species then in disturbed habitats are only about 1/4 of those that cause problems, and it's 2/3 for those from Europe and Eurasia. I have no idea what to read into that, if anything, what this might indicate. But it's pretty fascinating to see that kind of switcheroo. And so I've drawn this little red line across here so you can see all the green or temperate forest areas. So coming from Tennessee, going straight across kind of just south of Europe and Eurasia, and going right straight across China, Korea, and Japan. So in terms of latitude, in terms of climate, there's a lot of similarity, and obviously with temperate forest in terms of habitat for the northeastern United States. Also, same thing with, you notice a little bit on the western United States. We actually have 2 or 3 species that are listed as in disturbed habitats as invasive that are from North America, Western North America. So, but those are fairly rare. Again, most of ours are going to be with the other 2 continents. So if a species is going to go from being naturalized to becoming invasive, why? Why does that happen? How does that take place? Well, that whole evolution thing that we talked about. So there are checks and balances at play in systems that, again, keep things in a relative equilibrium. And part of that is based on competition, learning how to sort of hold your own against some of the other species that are out there so that you don't get completely overwhelmed by them, and spacing things out. You know, you do it this time, I'll do it that time, and we'll kind of minimize our opportunity to go head to head with one another. There are climate limitations at play here as well, and then pest and disease predation. So the pests and diseases evolved with the plants evolved with the pests and diseases. But there's still that check and balance that goes into play there. Well, you pluck a plant out of the environment where it has all this co-evolved competition, the climate limitations, and the pest and disease predation, and you put it into an area where those things are not there. It has an opportunity, if it has certain characteristics, to then kind of go crazy. And that's what some of our invasive species do. And what's the corollary to that is that our native species still have their checks and balances in place. They still have their competition, they still have their pests and diseases. And so, but they have not yet figured out how to effectively compete against the newcomers. So the newcomers have an advantage there. And if the newcomers happen to bring with them any of their pests and diseases, then our native plants are not going to have any defense against those. And we see that all the time, things coming in from chestnut blight back in the 20s, all the way to emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, et cetera, where our native plants are actually suffering dramatically from having to deal suddenly with pests or diseases that they've never been exposed to before, and therefore have no evolved defenses to help them survive that kind of interaction. So the federal government has actually defined what it is to be invasive and what constitutes an invasive species. So it's any species, including its seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material capable of propagating that species that is not native to that ecosystem. So that's why some things maybe in the Western United States can be problematic here, because it's a different systems. So whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And so this applies to all species, not just plants, but we're a plant society, so we're going to focus on plants. So there are certain characteristics, though, that given the lack of the co-evolved constraints, if plants our non-native species have certain characteristics, they are far more likely to become invasive and become pests. One of those is rapid growth. So you can think of tree of heaven or Paulownia, the princess tree, how rapidly they shoot up. Just in a matter of 2 or 3 years, they're basically, full canopy trees. If at a very young age, it can begin to flower and set fruit. It sets lots of fruit. It's very effective at getting that fruit and seed dispersed. And then, of course, the poster child here in the South, anyway, would be kudzu for rampant vegetative spread. But let's look at those first 4 again. Examine that: rapid growth, early flowering, copious seed production, and effective seed dispersal. And think of that from a standpoint of what in your garden would you think is a good characteristics for a plant. If you're going to buy a plant in a little pot, you want it to grow up to be the shrub or the tree reasonably quickly. You don't want to wait, 2 generations before, it gets there. So early flowering is the same thing. If you have to wait 15 or 20 years before it flowers, then, that's kind of a bummer. And if it's only going to produce like half dozen fruit or something, no, hundreds of fruit is what makes it ornamental and attractive, right? And if it's not bringing in wildlife to the garden, well, phooey. So those 4 characteristics are very strong ornamental characteristics for the selection of species for our gardens. So a lot of the things that have come in from Europe, from Asia, have brought in, have these kinds of characteristics. They're desirable from a gardener's perspective, but those are the very things then that will give them the leg up to be able to take advantage of the lack of co-evolved controls here and just go nuts. So the percentage of invasive plant species in Tennessee, approximately 82% of all the plants found here are native. So yay, that's good. About 18% are non-native. And about only 1.3% of all of these species are actually going to go on to be invasive. So it's a small number. It's not like there's just hundreds of them. There's just dozens of them. And so it's something that we can work with, especially from a standpoint of, gosh, this is so pretty. I'd really like to have it in my yard. I think you can find among our other plants something that will look just as good, perform just as well in the garden, that's not going to have that invasive baggage. So there's not that many that we're really talking about here. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem for most gardeners to find other alternatives to these invasive species. So as I mentioned, it's not just plants. Man, it's everywhere. So the insects, birds, mussels, fish, and mammals. So all different kinds of species. Here's just a sampling of those that are found here in Tennessee that are problematic invasive species from other taxonomic groups. And if you're a fisherman, well, you certainly don't want to surprise an Asian carp because they'll jump out of the water and cold cock you. slap you right upside the face. But all of these species have their own problems associated with them, and they cost a lot of money, a lot of tax dollars, a lot of time and effort, things that they supplant, whether it's in agriculture or other things. There's a loss of income with those things. There's a lot of fiscal stuff that goes along with this. It's very, very costly, especially when you try to factor in control, which is not cheap for these things. So when you have these invasive species, they get into our native systems. What exactly do they do? What problems do they create? So this list here, imagine it as a little dominoes set up side by side by side, and you kind of knock the first one over and tick, 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 they all begin to fall. So the thing about a lot of these species is that they're not very particular. So they're not specialists necessarily. They don't need a very, very narrow type of conditions in order to survive. They're generalists, and therefore a variety of conditions are just fine with them. They can do well. Therefore, they can get into a variety of different habitats and cause problems there. When they do, they push out or displace the native plants that are there. They don't kill them outright per se. They just take all the space. And so there's no place for the native plants to be, which then all the native wildlife that had been feeding on those plants and working with those plants no longer have a place to go. So you're disrupting these associations and reducing the diversity, sometimes significantly so, particularly when you get these vast infestations, almost monocultures of some of these invasive species. They also place a tremendous amount of stress on our rare and endangered species, not only those that are already rare and endangered, but they actually have made several of our species become rare and endangered because taking over habitat and pushing them out and so forth. So our rare endangered species suffer tremendously at the hands of invasives. Because of that connection with Laurasia and the strong connection from the flora of Asia and North America, there is the opportunity for some of these species to hybridize. A good example of that is the Asian bittersweet and American bittersweet. It will actually hybridize. So it can contaminate the genetics of our native plants, which is not good. They can bring over their non-native pathogens and pests, again, which our plants would have very little evolved defense to safeguard themselves against. When these plants get into systems and begin to take over, they can alter the processes of the ecosystem. So, for example, fire, there are communities that are adapted to fire. It's part of the renewal process for that community. But the behavior of that fire may change depending upon the invasive species that are brought in. It might burn more often, it might burn hotter, so that a community that's even adapted to fire might still be damaged by fire because the behavior of the fire has changed. Water along riparian corridors, for example, stream courses and rivers and creeks and so forth. Invasive species get in there and cause tremendous amount of difficulties there as well. And even when you think of like some of our wetlands, like vernal pools and so forth, invasive species get in, suck up all of that water, so that associations with maybe the life cycle of some of our amphibians gets short-circuited from the presence of these species. And they can also alter soil chemistry such that, you know, the germination of seeds and the successful growth of some of our native plants is actually stymied by the presence of chemicals that these plants will actually put into the soil. So they're out of balance and they do not function to the point that they can really severely impact the ecosystem, and in fact, get to the point sometimes where the whole thing might actually collapse. So one of the things I wanted to do was mention about 4 species that I want you guys to be on the lookout for. So some of these species are on the disturbed list, some of them are on the emerging list, some of them are on the established list, but look for them and report them. And I'm going to show you how to report them here in just a minute. But this is one of them that we're really watching out for. It's a pretty bad one here. The fig buttercup or lesser celandine, Ranunculus facaria, also known as Facaria verna. And but it looks an awful lot like marsh marigold. So if you live up in Upper East Tennessee, where marsh marigold actually occurs, be sure that you know which one you're looking at, and that you've successfully identified the appropriate one, so you're not either letting this one go crazy or trying to control our native marsh marigold. But you'll notice that the leaf, the back side of the leaf, has this sort of a glaucous bluish cast to it. It's highly reticulated, got that netted vein look to it. And then the flower itself has that nice little UV eye there, so bees can come in and find the center of that flower really well. So those are distinctive characteristics for this. It loves wet environments, so along riparian habitats on stream banks and so forth, or in wet areas, even just in your yard. There's a lady in Middle Tennessee. Normally this is in East Tennessee for the most part, but there was a lady in Middle Tennessee who had some of this in a low wet spot in her yard. And fortunately, she contacted us. We identified it for her and gave her directions on how to treat it and get rid of it. So be looking for this one. If you find it, definitely report it. So same with burning bush. So burning bush is lovely when it's got its fall color, and you can't mistake it. So, you know, looking for it in the fall is a good time to find it, because it's just going to scream at you from the woods. But it is invading our forests. It's very different from eastern wahoo and strawberry bush, which are our native euonymus species. So it's got a single fruit there that you can see, as opposed to those, either the warty or the smooth capsule that opens up and has several little seeds dangling from the inside of it. It's also one that develops those corky wings along the stem. Our native species don't do that. So if you see the single fruit, if you see the bright color, and if you see those corky wings, you're looking at burning bush. So that's something you definitely would want to get rid of and report. Nandina. So this has been around for a long time, and people love it. It's evergreen, especially in the Middle Tennessee area. You don't really have a lot of evergreens, so it's kind of nice. The foliage can sometimes get nice colors. It's got a pretty inflorescence of white flowers, and it's got this lovely orange and reddish orange fruit cluster that's so showy. The only problem with it is it's in a family that produces a lot of toxic compounds. And so those toxic compounds actually build up in the fruit. And birds that eat this fruit can accumulate too much of that toxic compound and be poisoned by it. Birds like cedar waxwings, for example, those that perch, hang out, and just gorge themselves on this. So they find cedar waxwings dead all the time. When they cut them open, take a look at them, their crop is full of nandina berries. And so they basically have just reached that threshold of toxicity that becomes fatal because they eat so much of it at one time. So nobody wants to kill birds. So if you've got a nandina plant, get rid of it. Or at least, cut the fruit off, if nothing else. And so there's actually one right next to my neighbor's house. It's right on my property, actually, but I go over there when they're not home and cut all the fruit off. So, because I don't want it spreading, and B, I don't want to kill cedar waxwings. So you can see two little seedlings here on the photo on the right. Those are nandina seedlings coming up at Cedars of Lebanon State Park, not too far from where there is a residential area. So somebody has nandina planted there. Obviously, birds are eating it and come over and poop it out in the park. So the leatherleaf mahonia, sometimes called Oregon grape holly. This one is actually from China. Berberis belii, also known as Mahonia belii. You can't mistake this one in the wintertime because it stands out like a sore thumb. It's about the only thing that's going to be green around here anyway, in the Middle Tennessee area during this time period. It will flower in January and sets fruit, these kind of larger fruits that have this bluish bloom on it. But it's a prickly, hard foliage. And so one of those things that I don't know why anybody would want to plant something like that. You can't get anywhere near it without, endangering life and limb. So, but people love it because of when it flowers. They love the fact that it's evergreen, and they love the fruit, and the birds will eat it. Then the birds then poop it. And when they do, little seedlings come up, and you can see that little seedling in the top right picture there. So you can see that the little spines are starting to develop on the leaf. But if you flip it over, it's green on the top side, but if you flip it over and look at the bottom side, it has that same waxy bluish bloom on the underside. So these as babies are really easy to identify. Just flip it over and look for that whitish blue kind of underside, and then pull that sucker. So I want to talk about these two vines for a couple of different reasons here. So everybody knows English ivy and winter creeper are terrible invasive species. And they're so far outside the barn. These horses have been gone for so long, getting them back inside is just not going to be possible. But that doesn't mean we have to give up on it. And so a couple of things I want to point out. With these vines, they will scramble across the ground, and then when they reach a tree, they will begin to climb up that tree. And so as they do, then that's a signal to them to mature. So they will flower and fruit when they go vertical. The whole part of a vine is to get up so that you can get that sunlight, right, and photosynthesize. So when they start going vertical, they know they've got it made, okay? They're on the home stretch, and so they can begin flowering and fruiting. So if you do nothing else, keep these things off of your trees. Do not let them go vertical, because that's when they flower and fruit. And then the birds eat the fruit, and it goes everywhere. Another thing, people really like English ivy because it has these lobed leaves. Well, when it starts going vertical and matures, it loses that lobing. And so you look at this, the photo on the right has both winter creeper and English ivy in it. So you see the darker leaves there that look cordate to ovate. That's the mature leaf of an English ivy. It has completely lost that lobing quality, which is a juvenile quality for that plant. So I want to show you the same tree that I photographed that had the two vines on it. I wish they would just kill each other, strangle each other to death, but unfortunately they don't. So further up in the canopy, this is what the English ivy was doing in there. And it's just a remarkable, this is just a few blocks from my house. I would love to go over and just ninja this thing to death one night, but I really don't think that would probably be a very good idea. Nonetheless, here it is. This is what the flowers look like. It produces blue fruit, kind of like a pea-shaped, round blue fruit that would be placed in these flowers here, in these kind of umbellate inflorescence of flowers that are just beginning to open. This was in early September, by the way. So each flower can set fruit, and that blue fruit is called a pyrene. And inside that pyrene, there is at least two, always two, and maybe as many as 5 seeds. So birds will eat that and they will poop it out. So let's just assume that there are 3 viable seeds in each one of these pyrenes. And in each umbel that there's, let's say, 15 flowers. The 2 that are pictured here have 17 to 20. So I'm being conservative here. So 15 flowers. And then I just sort of really underestimated 200 inflorescences on this tree. So at an absolute minimum, you're looking at 9,000 seeds that this sucker is producing every year. So that's a lot. And then the seedling up in the top, that's in my backyard. And I'd be willing to blame this guy who owns this property for that seedling in my backyard. But I'm sure there's dozens more just like it in the neighborhood as well. But cut it off your trees, ladies and gentlemen, cut them off your trees. I also want you to see what it will do to your trees. Now, it's not a parasite in that it doesn't steal something directly from the tree itself. It will take nutrients from the roots and the base so that, it will take some of the nutrients that otherwise would be available to the tree, but it doesn't actually take anything out of the tree like a mistletoe or other kind of parasite would. However, it is bad. So the photo on the left shows English ivy and winter creeper, and the photo on the right shows Virginia creeper. Now, both of these images are about that space apart, okay, along that same wall at Owl's Hill Nature Sanctuary in Brentwood, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. And so I was stunned by how different things look based on our native vines versus these non-native vines. Now, a lot of people complain about Virginia creepers being aggressive. They complain about poison ivy, etc. Well, if you were to look at the Virginia creeper tree here, you might notice there's a little bit of what looks like sort of brown or reddish in there with as you're going up and out the main branches of the tree. That is the red coloration, the fall coloration of the Virginia creeper. And so you can see that, I mean, it's growing all the way up into the top of the canopy, right? But you can barely tell that it's there. But if you look at the English ivy and winter creeper, it's obvious. I mean, it's completely coating the trunk, going all the way up to thick coating all the way into the canopy of these trees as well. And the fact that they are evergreen and then the Virginia creeper is deciduous is another factor that's extremely important, because wind is going to be a factor with all of this evergreen foliage. If we have a winter storm, say an ice storm, ice is going to coat every single one of those evergreen leaves. So it's going to add more weight. There's going to be more drag in wind. And so the idea for breakage, the possibility for breakage, the possibility for complete toppling of the tree is dramatically increased when you have vines of this nature on your tree, that our native vines simply don't present the same kind of threat. So on the TNPS website, we have several different things available that you can use, many wonderful resources. This is one of our newest ones that we've come out with. It's a step-by-step primer that walks you through identifying invasive species in your yard, methods of control and how to identify the best one, and then what to do once you've gotten rid of it, replanting, and of course we strongly advise the use of native plants. Part of what we have been promoting pretty much ever since we've been around is landscaping with native plants. And so the brochures that we have advocating native plants just in general, and then specifically offering alternatives to some of the non-native invasive species that are still being sold in nurseries within the state of Tennessee. So you have an opportunity then, if you like a certain look or certain characteristics about a particular non-native species that's invasive, then you can look here and see what native species might give you that similar look. And so what I'd like to do right now, if I may, is call up the TNPS website. So it's tnipc.org. And so here's our homepage. I try to keep this up to date. I'm the person that's supposed to do this, so if it's not, you can blame me. But right now it is up to date. So things coming up, including the conference here, November 30th and December 1st. Some of you probably know Steve Manning with Invasive Plant Control. So this is like the third or fourth year he's had this Innovations in Invasive Species Management. And one of his speakers here in Nashville on the 30th, that evening, is going to be Doug Tallamy. And the public can come. It's $10 at the door to be able to come in, and you can go online and register and just indicate that you'll pay at the door, and then you don't have to pay the online fee for it, and come and hear Doug talk if you're interested, if you're in this area and would like to do so. And what I'll do is get that information to Karen, and then she can share it with all of you folks. So if you do live in this area and want to participate in that, you can. I also want to point out the second one, the NAISMA, the North American Invasive Species Management Association. They have a program called Play, Clean, Go that encourages people who recreate in the wild to clean their gear in between outings. So, scrape off all the mud on your boots. So before you go back on another trail, so that you're not carrying seeds and so forth that will move these species from one park to another park, one trail to another trail, one part of the state to another part of the state. So same thing with boats and fishing gear and all that kind of stuff. Clean those things so that you don't wind up inadvertently introducing an invasive species to an area where it otherwise does not occur. So I want to point that out. So if you're interested in knowing more about us, up here at the very top, you can find out a little bit more about the history. We used to be called the Tennessee Exotic Pest Plant Council. but everybody thought we were insects. And so we're not. And but a lot of organizations that were also EPSIs began changing to invasive plant councils. And so we decided to do that too. So we moved from being a 10 EPSI to being a 10 IPSI. So anyhow, contact us if you have a question and want to ask us something. Go here down at the very bottom here. You'll see invasives at tnipc.org. So you can send us an email. And we have a wonderful board of directors with some great people from federal agencies, state agencies, private individuals as well. So a very different kind of folks and so forth that are on here that all have at their core a real interest in educating people about invasive species and helping to get rid of those species. So some cool people on our board. On the initiatives page, various projects that we support are there. I definitely check this out. There may be some really cool things there that you might be able to use, including organizing an invasive plant removal project, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe a local park or whatever. And then also the weed wrangles. And I want to give a real push for our weed wrangles. So Invasive Plant Control and the Garden Club of Nashville got together several years ago now and started weed wrangles here in Nashville. And it has not only spread statewide, it has spread across the country. So there are weed wrangles now all across the United States. And it's the first weekend of March. So March 5th of 2022 is going to be the weed wrangle. All state parks participate in this. So if you've got a state park close to you, you can go and help remove invasives on that Saturday morning. There are lots of other organizations in the state that also do this, various nonprofits and other environmental groups that sponsor it in various places. So you can go to this particular thing where my little cursor is going round and round now, the weed wrangles here, and find out about some of the other places in the state and how you can volunteer to help with that. I also want to point out these two manuals here, the Miller guides for identification and for management are excellent. And so you can open these up online and research what you want, or you can download them on your own computer and have your own copy. So they are from the Forest Service, and they are free. Part of what Play Clean Go with the North American Invasive Species Management Association promotes is boot brush stations and educating people with a little kiosk associated with that boot brush. So you can buy a kit from the Play Clean Go program with NISMA, or you can come here and get basic construction guidelines to build your own if you would like to do that. So we have that on our website as well. And one other thing, I'm going to scroll down real quick because I want to point out this to you. So if you go shopping for native plants, whether you're going to Home Depot or your local garden center, before you go, download this, print it out, and cut it across the horizontal lines and take these in with you, because if any of your places where you shop are selling invasive species like English ivy, for example, then you can leave one of these cards with them, right? English ivy on the left-hand side here, and then leave it with the retailer and let them know that this plant is an invasive species. So for those who aren't very up on what's going on, it may be their first clue that it's an invasive species. So that's one thing that's important about it. But the most important thing about it is they will recognize that their customers know that this are invasive species and that their customers don't want these plants. So that can be a very powerful message to send that maybe could convince some of these people to stop selling some of these plants. So I did want to mention that as well. So our landscaping tab here, the brochures that I showed you at the end of the slide presentation, landscaping with native plants, the early iterations of that one, which we did one for each of the grand divisions of the state. All of these are available for download. There's the native plants alternative brochure. And here is the homeowner primer. So by all means, help yourself to these. We have a native plant gardening reading list It's recently been updated, so you can download that and check that out. There are other resources online, like TVA's fact sheet and plant lists for homeowners featuring native plants, nurseries in the state that are native plant nurseries, native plant sales and botanical gardens at nature centers across the state, the native plant conferences like Cullowhee, for example, and then web links. And so first on the list, there's the Tennessee Native Plant Society. Now, those of you who do know me and know that I do have that book, I had a website for a long time, but if you were to click on this puppy, oops, I wasn't updating this sucker. And so it's like, I'm really pretty tired of having an out-of-date website. So it's gone, and I need to take that off. So I will deactivate that link. But anyway, so a couple of other things I want to show you here real quick. So the invasive plant lists. Remember, I had told you we had two. So we have the emerging and established threat, and then we have the disturbed habitat threat. Excuse me. So when you go to this tab, the invasive plants tab up here, this page you land on is the page that's going to have the established and emerging threat species on it. All right. You can download the whole list as an Excel file if you want, or you can search it and you can determine what you want to search it for. Do you just want grasses? It'll only then propagate it with the grasses. Do you only want to see things that are grasses that are emerging? Well, there you are, the emerging grasses, okay? So you can do it any way you want to in terms of curating your own information. So when you get to this page, if you want to find out more about a particular species, click on that species and you'll have its own page that will feature pictures, a written description of the plant itself, links to additional images from the invasive.org and Bugwood online resources, life history, habitat, origin. Of course, Ailanthus is native to China. It's one of our Asian. So the management recommendations here as well. So different mechanical means of control and different herbicidal means of control for this particular plant. Another thing in here that's kind of cool is similar species. So a lot of people have a tendency to confuse tree of heaven with black walnut. And so we let you know here some of the differences, how to tell our two walnuts, butternut and black walnut, from this one, so you don't confuse the species and don't wind up killing one of our native plants. We do the same with the sumac down here, if you look over here, and then landscape alternatives. So you can click on that if you I can't imagine anybody liking Tree of Heaven, but if you did and you wanted something with that kind of a look, here's examples of things that can give you that kind of look from our ashes, black locust, black walnut, etc. So these are ways in which you can learn more about it. So again, at the invasive plants page, so this is the one that's got the disturbed, emerging and established threat. But there's a link to the disturbed habitats. So you can click on that and get this list. It also, you can sort it by type if you want to. And here they all are. Listed in alphabetical order by their scientific name. And so you can select any of these. The same kind of page, same kind of information that you saw with the other is going to be available for each of these as you go along. Now, the last thing I want to do here is tell you how to report invasive species. I kept telling you that I wanted you to report those burning bushes and mandinas and so forth. So you can go to report invasives. And then there are connections to EDMAPS, Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And it's a real easy thing to do. And so I'm going to show you how, okay? So if you have a species you want to report, you can click on the EDMAPS link. And there you go. So we are at EDMAPS. And what you're going to do is go to web reporting, the very first item here underneath. So you go to web reporting, and you're going to enter your email and a login. So I'm already in here. So, but once you've got all that done, then you can go in And then you have an opportunity to report any kind of invasive species, whether it's an animal, a disease, an insect, or plants. Of course, we're going to be doing plants. So when you click on plants, then it says, where are you? Where are you going to be? So we are in Tennessee. So we're going to click on Tennessee. And then what pops up is an invasive plant occurrence report. And you fill out and put the information here for it. So we're going to say, we're going to do the English ivy, all right? So I'm going to put Hedera here. So what it will do then is it will populate this with anything that has Hedera in it, all right? Well, there's your English ivy right there. Well, some of you may not feel comfortable with that, and you much prefer to do it this way. Well, every common name that has English as part of it is going to be there, and there's our English ivy. So what is your observation date? When you first log in and start this, it's going to have today's date on it. But if you saw this yesterday or last week, then you go in and put the date in there that's suitable for you. Anything that's in red is required. You have to fill out something in that particular field. The rest of them, it's optional. It's not necessary, but any more information that you can provide is going to be helpful. And so part of that is understanding how big the area is. So estimation of the area that contains only the species of interest. So this is if you're looking at just a monoculture, all right? And in that case, then you're going to look at, are you going to measure it by acres, hectares, feet, or meters? The same thing applies to survey area here, but the survey area includes other things, not just the invasive species. So that may be easier for you to do. And again, the same thing, acres, square feet, square meters, etc. The other thing is habitat. And so they give you all these things to be able to look through. So a hardwood forest, mixed one, et cetera, et cetera. And you even have yard and garden down here. So you can list something in your neighborhood kind of thing as well. But this is for all over. So beach and dune and stuff that doesn't apply at all to Tennessee is going to show up in this particular one. If you wanted to give percent cover, so this is basically looking at the percentage of it. So is there how much it covers? If you were to look down on it, how much of a percentage would be covered by this particular plan? Just a little bit, or up to as much as 25% or more of the area that you're referring to. And then abundance is important. Are you talking about a single plant, scattered plants, a dense stand, or scattered dense patches? Plant description here, is it a mature plant? Is it a seedling? And then the phenology. Is it in flower? Is it in fruit? Is it dormant right now? And then they ask about damage. They want to know if something's chewing on it and eating it, which could be interesting because they've actually found that there are some things now that are starting to plague some of our invasive species. And so it's nice to know if something perhaps is going after it. So the next thing is, where are you specifically? And we've already told them Tennessee, so they put in Tennessee. So in the county, you're going to enter your county. And I'm going to do Davidson because it's mine. And so it'll automatically here, the map just begins to zoom in right on the Davidson County area. And you can expand this all the way out so that you can zoom in and you can find exactly where it is you want to go. And let's see, where is it that I want to go? I don't want to go there. Where do I want to go? Hang on a second. 440. Where am I? I'm trying to figure out where I am. All right. So Leland, Granny White, Belmont. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to take you guys in and I'm going to show you my children's elementary school right there. Okay. And then I can go back out and boom, there's my kids' elementary school right there. So you can add a marker, and I can put a marker right on that building. And when I do, it populates the latitude and longitude. So if you can use a satellite map to pinpoint the place where you found this, then you don't have to worry about collecting latitude and longitude. But if you're out in the open somewhere You could use it with your phone to get latitude and longitude. Again, this is in black, so you don't have to put it in, but it sure is nice if you can be specific about these kinds of things. You might also enter other descriptions and so forth here as well. They want to know about the ownership of the property. Since this is Davidson County Elementary School, city government would be an owner, but they've also got private landowner, in addition to various state lands and federal lands and so forth that you can enter. Now here's the key. The key is pictures. So using your phone or any camera, take pictures of some of the diagnostic features of that plant. We're talking about English ivy, you want to get the foliage, obviously. So if it is in flower, get that inflorescence. If it's in fruit, get that fruit. So show it, the whole thing on the tree, for example. You can enter up to 5 images on here. So download or upload actually those images onto the site. It's very easy to do. Choosing the file, it will let you, easily pick what it is, and boom, pops it right in to there. So once you get those uploaded, then the last thing it asks is whether or not you've collected a specimen. Most of us aren't going to do that, but there's some folks, that do for herbaria, collect a specimen. So you would indicate that, and then make any other comments that you might have about what's happened, and then click submit report. And you will get an email saying that they've received your report. What happens when you submit the report is there is a verifier in the state of Tennessee, a person who reviews this, and your photos are really critical here because they look at your photos to make sure that the English ivy you've identified is in fact English ivy. And when they have verified it, then they approve it, and the data that you have submitted goes into EdMaps. It will be populated then into EdMaps, and you will get an email letting you know that it has been verified. But if the verifier has any questions, then they will be able to contact you by email and ask you some specific questions about it. So this is important, guys. This is really important because we have been able, we meaning TNPS, working with the Department of Agriculture, have been able to add some of these formerly horticultural ornamental species like Chinese privet to the pest plant rule in the state of Tennessee. And they are now not allowed to sell, and you are not allowed to buy that plant in the state of Tennessee. If we want to add any others onto this list, we need these data. This is what gives us the ammunition that we can take to the Department of Agriculture and make a strong case for adding these other species. The nursery industry is powerful in this state. It's got a powerful economic interest in this state, but they don't care about data. All they care about is my daddy grew it, my granddaddy grew it and sold it. Why can't I grow it and sell it? I don't see Chinese privet growing out wild anywhere out here. So they just deny. And but we come with hard data, and the Department of Agriculture responds to that. But if we don't have that hard data, then we can't back up our claims that Nandina needs to be added to the pest plant rule in the state of Tennessee. That gives us then the legal authority to limit how much that plant is sold, if at all, in the state of Tennessee. So put on your citizen science caps and get out there. When you find these invasive species, take pictures, get information, go into EdMaps and put that information in for us and help us build that database so that we have then a good opportunity to go and make a strong case to the Department of Agriculture. So does anybody have any questions?
Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a lot to digest, but it's
Yeah.
exciting that you've given us tools so that we can start taking some actions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, let me see. We have some questions in the chat here. It was interesting. One of the chat comments arrived, was typed out just before you answered it.
Oh.
Is there a push to get nurseries to stop selling invasive species? I was shocked to see winter creeper for sale at a local nursery. And the next words out of your mouth, the next slide was those cards to leave with the nursery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, winter creeper is not on the list. English ivy, I don't think is on the list. In fact, let's see, initiative, I believe in here, you can go and actually see what is on the list. There we go. Tennessee Department of Agriculture, Pest Plant Rule, 2009. Here it is. This is what, so you can't buy purple loosestrife, you can't buy Chinese privet, European privet, Kogon grass, the bush honeysuckle, and multiflora rose, autumn olive, and a couple of other things that nobody would actually be purchasing for that anyway. But if we wanted to add to this, if we wanted to include Nandina or burning bush, we need our ducks, and they need to be strong ducks in a row in order to make an argument. So, and calorie pear, you can still buy Bradford pear. Calorie pear is everywhere. And that's one that really ought to be on this list, because nobody in their right mind wants to buy a calorie pear anymore.
No, not when it takes bulldozers to get the trees out.
Oh, I know.
It's tenacious.
I know. And talk about just a trash tree. I mean, it splits and breaks and stinks and everything else. So
yeah,
it's bad. It's bad. But this is what we would be attempting to do, is go to the Department of Agriculture with that data and try to make as strong a case as possible to adding other species onto that, whether it's winter creeper, English ivy, whatever it may be.
Okay. Question from Steve Ford. The Nashville Zoo is rife with Amur honeysuckle. I contacted them about it and they told me they love their honeysuckle. Geez. Oh.
Well, that might be an opportunity maybe to meet with the person perhaps who is in charge of landscaping there, grounds crew, ground maintenance, and to talk to them about, there may be something about disturbing the animals' habitats, I don't know. I mean, they may have, from their perspective, valid reasons for it, but it's also a ripe opportunity to educate and attempt to let them know why you think it's important, and give them the information so that at least perhaps maybe some of the public areas they can try to get rid of it. But you know what, even if the zoo cleaned every bit of that out, there's enough of that. And here in Davidson County in particular, it's just ridiculous. Birds are going to poop it right back into the zoo. So it's one of those that's, you can't say stop fighting it, but it's an ongoing, never-ending battle.
Does anyone have questions? If so, unmute yourself or raise your hand. Let us know. Other tidbits or other comments in the chat are excellent. So glad to learn about that site to report. Thank you. What a great presentation. Deborah Rosenthal has a question. What species should we target for data gathering to get banned? Are there some that are more likely than others? If I gather data on all of the invasives around me, I'll never have time for anything else.
Well, I mean, obviously the ones that you want to concentrate on are those that are still sold commercially, because that's what we'd want to try to ban. And I would look at things on the emerging list and the either established list or emerging list, and which species are still commercially available and which are you seeing in your area, and focus on those. And if you also go to this page that I already have up here, you'll see which ones are already banned. And then if it's not on this list, it's fair game, baby. So enter that data and help us see if we can't add a few more critical species to this list. So just do what you can. I'm not asking you to do everything.
Kay Matthews asks, what about crepe myrtle? Outstanding, Margie. Loved your start with Pangea along with determining factors of what makes plants definitive for becoming invasive. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Crepe myrtle. I've heard some people talk about that as it's kind of starting to show up here and there. Nothing that we've been able to document. So as far as I know, it's still okay. I've heard some people talk about Japanese maples showing up too. Lots of seedlings showing up in a couple of different areas, but nothing that has been brought to anyone's attention. So.
Okay. Wendy has asked, what invasive plants are top of your list, like crepe myrtle and butterfly bush?
Top of my list?
Yes.
I don't know. My list is TNPS's list, really. So in terms of what I battle here, I battle winter creeper, I battle English ivy, I battle some mahonia, I battle some nandina, and one of the worst that is actually driving me crazy now, and it's not on the TNPS list, and that's the Italian arum, Arum italicum. It is a kind of it's like Jack in the Pulpit. So, but it doesn't, it's a little different. It winds up with fruit that has that same kind of a fruit cluster as like Jack in the Pulpit does. And it puts up foliage at this time of year. It's just emerging right now. So it'll photosynthesize in the wintertime, the foliage dies down, and then you get the fruit stalk later on. And that sucker is intense from a gardening perspective, and I hate it. One that is on the list too that I battle all the time, creeping liriope, that creeping monkey grass. Oh golly, I ruined my rotator cuff last year since the whole world was shut down. I actually worked in my garden and trying to dig that stuff out of there. And I was in physical therapy for 2 months trying to adjust after trying to dig out all that creeping monkey grass. So, but hey, take your pick. There's plenty to go around.
Diane Arvin asks, what is the best way to educate the general public? I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that so many plants are invasive that seem so common. Thank you for a great presentation. Very important, and so much needs to be done.
Indeed, so much does need to be done. Well, that's where the TNPS website can come in really handy. Even our brochures, especially the alternatives brochure, the one that hang on a second here. This guy right here, the Tennessee's Native Plant Alternatives to Non-Native Invasives. That one talks about the problem, okay, and explains a lot about what invasive species are doing. And so gathering information like this and the primer as well, there's a lot of good information in that explaining the problem too. So these are good resources to use to begin to develop a good argument that you could use to persuade others about the importance of the issue.
Yes. Kay Matthews asks, Tree of Heaven is taking over Machatcher Parkway and all disturbed areas of Franklin. Is there a way to encourage municipalities to begin control?
That's a good question. Again, I would say that would be a good thing to go to, I guess, what would it be? Parks, with like the city parks, or other maintenance, maybe public works, and just try to talk to them, sit down with them, maybe get together 2 or 3 people and ask for a meeting to talk to them, to point out the problem, get all of your information together, go take pictures, and let them know what you see as the problem, and if you can, to try to what they could do in place of that. So if it's spreading, then obviously they've got to get rid of these trees, which is sometimes not an easy thing to do, but then what could they put back in its place? And of course, it's also going to cost money. So it's got to be budgeted as well, because it's expensive to remove these things, to treat them, control, and then to replant with something else. But so I definitely bring it to their attention. So as much as you can, get a group together and meet with people from Public Works and maybe Parks and Rec.
Tim Keltenbach asks or says, I have been removing invasives from the woods behind my house, working on it for 8 years, and I'm adding back all of the natives I can find.
Yay.
Yes.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Kudos to you, Bob.
Thank you. I have a 1.3 acre lot right in Nashville in the West Mead section.
Mhm.
When I moved in, the woods, which are about half the property, were completely 100% infested with honeysuckle, the 2 vincas, the ivy, the winter creeper, and I have done everything and learned over the 8 years. Now I'm just digging it out bit by bit by bit, and I am making quite a bit of progress. I've added over 60 native species back into the forest.
Congratulations. That's
Yeah.
magnificent. Thank you. As a fellow
Someday
Nashvilleian.
Someday I want to have a tour once I get it into decent shape, and have wildflower tours in my yard.
Did you take pictures before to show all those invasives in there so people can appreciate the scope of what you've accomplished?
Oh yeah, I should. And in fact, they're still, they still dominate. So I've got many, many years of work ahead of me.
You have one of those weed wrenches. Those things are awesome for the bush honeysuckle.
Yes, a honeysuckle popper. I bought that online from a man in Indiana. And so those are disappearing. I'm getting them out of there. Today I was digging out Vinca major and Vinca minor, and replacing it with the native strawberry Fragaria.
Oh, that's nice. That'll be tasty too.
I hope.
So are you doing all mechanical removal, or are you doing any kind of herbicidal application?
Nowadays, all mechanical. I used in the beginning, I would cut the honeysuckle bushes off and then spray very carefully the trunk with Roundup. But I've decided that Roundup is really too dangerous to use, and so I haven't used it in years. So now I physically dig everything out.
Well, with some of the things, the stuff that you're talking about, that works, and particularly at a relatively smaller scale that you're talking about. I'm no fan of Monsanto or Bayer whatsoever, but glyphosate is a valuable tool in the fight against invasive species. And so when you're talking large scale infestations, a chemical control is the only way to really get a heads up on some of this stuff. And so, but it is a tool, and it has to be used appropriately and effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got to follow the directions. It's the indiscriminate use of herbicides that are the problem, more so than any one particular herbicide in and of itself, such as Roundup. So I'm not a fan. I don't use it unless, I don't use it. I, like you, mechanical removal. But if I had something big, large scale, it can sure make fast work of it and give you some pretty good control quickly in an area. It's just use it appropriately and judiciously.
Right.
Steve Ford comments, for 20 years, I have been trying to rid my 12 acres of Amur honeysuckle. My wife and daughters keep telling me I will never win, and I'm starting to think they are correct. Should I give up?
Oh, golly, no. You give up, you die.
No.
I mean, just keep the fight going, man,
Yes.
What else have you got to do?
If nothing else, it's a good workout.
Absolutely,
You know,
absolutely.
pay a gym fee.
Yeah. It's like Henry David Thoreau said about firewood. It warms you up when you're chopping it, and it warms you up when you're burning it. So just go out there, especially this time of year. You can still easily tell what they are and burn some calories.
Quick question from Susan. Please spell the product Margie just recommended. I think that was maybe the glycophosphate.
Yes.
Glyphosate.
Oh,
Glyphosate is the generic name for Roundup.
HOSA.
So, I think Bettina's spelling it. So, yeah.
Thanks.
So if we were to go back here and let's see.
Alan has it spelled out in the chat.
He did. Yeah,
Okay.
he did.
He spelled it out. All
He
right.
was
Good.
quicker than me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Another comment is the uprooter works great on mid-sized honeysuckle bushes. And another one commented, Joe Brachetto commented weed wrench.
Yeah.
There's a lot of products out there.
Yeah. I used to think it was weed winch. But it's
That
weed
would work
winch.
too, but
So yeah, but it sounds a little more risque. But with the weed winch,
I like honeysuckle popper myself.
yeah, that's a cool one. It is.
yeah.
Yeah, there are also little cool tools out there. So they got big ones, and they have smaller ones that you can get like underneath stuff and use. So they're two different sizes. One of them is like a tabletop version of it, and then the great big one that gives you that nice leverage to pop stuff out of the ground. So if you got a lot, that's a great tool to have.
We have been working, David has been working on removing the invasives from behind our house. We're up against the Greenway and in the community that we live in. So he's been working on that ever since we moved in this area about 7 years ago. And his comment tonight, he didn't write it out, but I'll know he would be saying it if he felt like writing it. Right now is a great time to pick out the privet, because it's the green behind our house. Anything that's green behind a house right now is game for pulling it up.
Right. It's also a good one to go after in the weed wrangles, because it's typically going to be green throughout the winter too, for the most part, unless we have a really, really, really severe winter. And so it's one of the few things that's going to have leaves on it in the Middle Tennessee area anyway, on March 5th. So definitely volunteer with those weed wrangles, guys, okay?
Another comment from Cynthia at Swan Conservation. Some of the bushes, if they've been growing for many years, when you remove them, new seedlings pop up by the hundreds. Any suggestions? Privet, autumn olive, to name a couple bad ones.
Yeah, anytime you're going to disturb the soil, you're going to have that happen. And so the main thing to do perhaps is recognize that that's going to be the case, and then just go in and hoe those little puppies the instant they start to come up, before they have a chance to do any get big and create problems. So grab them as a seedling when they're just starting to come up, and just scuffle a hoe across there, and just give it a little bit of time to let those things come up and get out of the soil before you start to replant anything. And then you don't have to worry about working around a plant you're trying to protect to get these other little things out of the way. So it may be just giving them a little bit more time to germinate and then eliminate those. That's an idea.
And one thing to keep in mind is that the native plants will return. In many cases, the seeds are still there in the seed bank,
Absolutely.
soil bank, and they will come up. We have been amazed at the natives that have been popping up behind our home. Ones that were suppressed by the invasives for so long, and now suddenly we've got all these unique things.
I know. It's
beautiful.
great. Life renewing itself. They're there. They just haven't got any sunlight and air and water. So they're just it's amazing how many of them hang out and persist, and come back as soon as you give them the slightest opening.
Belinda Moss asks, is there a group, organization, or other support system that assists individuals in removing larger invasives, such as Tree of Heaven, in lieu of expensive companies?
Oh,
That's a tough
Um,
one.
no. No, not that I know of. I mean, no. You might maybe advertise in like a neighborhood newsletter for somebody. I don't know, Hands on Nashville kind of thing, you know, where they will take on projects and help, like sometimes elderly people with painting their house and those kinds of things. And so it's possible that some other kind of civic organization like that might be willing to take that on as a project. So you could, check with that. If you know somebody who his company likes to go out and do things in the community, maybe you could find something. Or hey, if you can convince a teenager to do some, of course they just typically, you're talking about taking down a tree. I don't know that you want a teenager doing that, but that could be a little dangerous.
I have,
Oh, one other thing too, you have to be careful with Tree of Heaven if you're taking it down, because you can't just cut that thing down. It will sprout from the roots and you'll have 30 trees of heaven there. So it actually needs to be taken care of chemically. And there's a way to do it that's very helpful. It's called the hack and squirt. I love it because it sounds like a Marx Brothers name, hack and squirt. So you take an axe, and around the diameter of the tree, you make a little downward hatch into it, right? That cuts into the trunk, into the cambium layer. Move around about another 1 to 2 inches, make another one of those, and then around, and then another one of those. So you've got maybe 3, 4, 5 of those around, and in each one of those, squirt the appropriate concentration of herbicide. And what that will do by leaving those strips, it will continue to grow and move stuff up and down, but it will also then suck that herbicide down into the roots, and it will kill the plant. If you just cut it off, then it's like, oh, I've lost my leader. I need to make another one and another one and another one and another one. And so you just have them everywhere. So with some things like that respond in that method, herbicide is the effective control for it. So and that way it's targeted. You're only putting it in that little cut, those few cuts around there. You're not spraying foliage. There's no drift going anywhere else. You just a little bit just right inside there. That kind of targeted approach with an herbicide works really, really well.
Okay, Richard Hitt has a question. Some nurseries have stopped selling the straight species of Bedelia davidi, but have replaced it with what they call environmentally friendly cultivars. These cultivars usually have a low rate of viable seeds. Does TNPS have a position on these?
Well, for the most part, I mean, any attempts that they're making to try to make it better, we would encourage. But we all know that's, we've seen that happen with the privet before, where
Bradford pears.
And well, Bradford pear is a kind of a different situation. It is self-sterile, but as soon as they changed the genetics by trying to get it to be less of a trash tree, then suddenly it was no longer self-sterile, and it also hybridized with a common pear. So the problem though with things that are supposedly sterile is they can put out a shoot that reverts to species. And so then that one, I mean, you've seen that with things like that are variegated, and there will be a sprout, a sport that comes off of it that's all green and not variegated. And that can happen too. And then you've got some that have perfectly viable seeds associated with it. So it's by no means a foolproof method. So I would be skeptical about it. I know they're lovely shrubs, they attract butterflies, but we have so many beautiful native shrubs that attract butterflies too, that I don't think it's worth taking that risk.
Harlan comments, there's a Facebook group, Invasive Plant ID and Removal in the United States and Canada. And that's in the chat if anybody wants to write that long name out.
All right. Now there's great online resources, not just the TNPS website, but so by all means, Google can be your friend.
Sure can. I think we need to let you go and say goodnight. Some folks, it's getting pretty late for them, those in the eastern area.
Good night.
Night.
So, thank you, Margie. This was excellent. It
You're
was well needed and it's definitely appreciated. I have some questions for you, but I'll put them in an email.
All right, that sounds good. That'll work for
Great
me.
job. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margie.
Thanks, Margie.
You're very welcome.
Good night, everyone.